Just very quickly before I introduce my two panelists, I just want to ask, how many of you have a 10-year-old daughter or have had a 10-year-old daughter? Okay, which means you know this joke. Girls go to Mars to get to be stars. Boys go to Jupiter to get to be stupider. Who knows that one? Who's heard that one before? Okay. We have a Mars and a Jupiter problem with our energy and environment conversations. We actually have two conversations that don't often intersect. Two conversations that start off asking different questions, have suspicions about the other one, they can get theological. So it's my privilege to introduce two people who have voluntarily offered to bring them together. Frances Beinecke is the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, the environmental nonprofit group. She's been there for more than 30 years. She's been a member of President Obama's Commission on the Deepwater Horizon Gulf Spill. She studied environmental studies at Yale. She lives in New York, and she's originally from where in New Jersey? Summit, New Jersey. Tom Fanning is from New Jersey as well, so this is going to go really smooth.
Let's hear it for Florham Park.
Yeah. Tom Fanning is the chairman, president, and CEO of Southern Company, where he's also worked for more than 30 years. It's the number 2 size utility in the country. It is building 2 new nuclear plants that the U.S. has not seen in a long time. He has been a member of Florida Governor Bush's transition team, and he lives in Atlanta right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the basic facts about the boom and the environmental issue. And then we're going to think about how these conversations can interact with each other. And we're going to go to audience questions pretty quickly in this hour. So let me ask the audience a couple questions kind of to establish the energy, the fossil fuel boom that's happening in the United States. So the International Energy Agency projected that the U.S. would overtake Saudi Arabia as the largest oil producer. So the question is when? I'm going to give you 3 choices: 2015, 2020, or 2030. So raise your hand if you think they projected to be around 2015. Okay, good number of you. 2020. Bigger number? 2030. A couple of you. Okay, so they said around 2020. So that is a picture of how many barrels of oil we're increasingly producing now and what they think the future is going to be. Let me ask one more question about natural gas. Right now, a unit of natural gas is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 right now. It's a measure, obviously, of how much we're producing now. Let's go back not too long to 2008 when we had a lot less of it. What do you think the price of it was around then? So now it's about 4. Back then, do you think it was around 8 or 12 or 18? Raise your hand if you think it was $8. Twice as much as now. Okay, a few of you. How about 12? More. $18. So it was around $12. So it was 3 times per unit of natural gas what we have now. So the question, and either you can jump in first, is first of all, on the energy side of the story, is this a big deal and why? Let me ask Tom to go first.
Well, it's an enormous deal. I was on a panel this morning that talked about what's the right portfolio. There really is no such thing. What we have to do, I think, is recognize kind of where we are and balance the objectives of clean, safe, reliable, affordable energy for the families we serve. And just to define that, 48% of the families that we serve in the Southeast make less than $40,000 a year. Plus, it's really important to drive the economy forward. And energy, I think, gives us a great opportunity to do that now. So I've got to combine, I think, a balancing function among all these things. And when I think about the technology revolution, that has provided us an opportunity to have more gas than we ever realized was attainable economically, and have a low price and have reasonably low volatility, there's a lot of interesting questions that come out to that. Is gas a dominant solution? Probably. Is it a panacea? No. There are lots of important questions.
So we'll get into, we'll get a little bit into natural gas, but for this is your starting point that this is, as far as an economic pillar for the future of the U.S. economy, that's where the story starts?
Sure,
Yeah.
but so is everything else. Nuclear. I think we
Okay.
need to balance out the portfolio with coal and energy efficiency and renewables. I think renewables are one of the exciting stories of the next 10 years.
Okay, great. Well, let me ask you about the domestic, right now, the domestic fossil energy story, for instance. And do you think this is is this a big deal?
Well, it is a big deal, but I put it in, all of our energy picture, in my mind, has to be put in the frame of climate change. So whatever our energy mix is, if there's a significant fossil fuel component, whether it's coal or a larger piece of natural gas, they're still fossil fuels and they're contributing to climate change. So as we figure out what our energy picture is in the country, factoring in the urgency of action on climate change and reducing emissions and unlocking the technologies that are going to control carbon has to be a pivotal part of the equation. To have an energy strategy for the country that doesn't take that into effect is, I think, a disaster, not even waiting to happen, happening now. And that's why I think it's so important. I mean, this week, probably everyone in this room knows, the president made a pivotal speech on what his climate strategy was in the next 3.5 years. That's something we in the environmental community have been waiting for, actually demanding all through his first term. And now we have it. And I think joining what our energy strategy is to our climate strategy, having this be one and the same, and not what is our strategy for energy independence, and by the way, how are we going to address climate change? Those cannot be two separate questions. They have to be addressed together.
Wouldn't you agree? In fact, it's the same question. In other words, this is not a false choice. We've got to figure out a way to do both. And so,
We do.
and it's
And
not.
we will.
Yeah, in fact, we got together a little bit this morning, and one of the things we just took off on, it'd be interesting to chat about with you all, is just kind of the role of innovation in moving energy policy in America forward that helps balance all of those responsibilities that at least I call.
So, Scott, if I could just address that for a second, because I think, 4 or 5 years ago, before the natural gas boom, when people thought energy, we had to import more energy and it was more constrained, there was a lot of enthusiasm about innovation going in new directions, not maybe addressing climate head on, but really trying to figure out what a proactive, efficient energy policy is for the country. One of the challenges with the natural gas boom is it makes it easy not to do that because it's a domestic supply. So the urgency of addressing energy needs has lessened, even though the urgency of addressing climate change has increased. And I think, we have to figure out, as I said, to bring those conversations together. So people are like, natural gas is so abundant, we don't have, and it's cleaner than coal, so we don't have to address the urgency of carbon. We do.
I couldn't agree more. In fact,
All right, here's what I'm going to do. Sorry, I want to put the environment side, just a couple facts on the table so to facilitate exactly what you're talking about. Just so we're all on the same page as far as climate. 2 numbers for you, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands again. Copenhagen 2009, world leaders agreed to keep temperature rise, global temperature rise within 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial era, 3.5 Fahrenheit or so. So the International Energy Agency has tried to measure how much of that is locked in already, based on the transportation and the buildings and the energy sector we have now. So I want to ask you, how much do you think is locked in? How much of this 2 degrees, according to the IEA, is locked in? Do you think it is half locked in, or 80% locked in, or 100% locked in? How many say half?
What do you mean by locked in?
That is that because
It's already happened.
of the infrastructure we have now, everything that is built now, how much of because so many of these greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time, a lot of that is locked in between now and then. And so the question is, if there are no changes, and based on what we have now, the IEA has said that X% of that 2 degree future, of those emissions, those projected emissions, are already locked in. How many of you think 50% is locked in? Okay, a couple of you, 80%. few more, and 100%. So the IEA said 80% in the 2012 World
Context, right.
Energy Outlook, yeah, that 80% of that is locked in as they see it. And then one question about Arctic ice. September 2007 was one of the record years for how the amount of Arctic ice. It was so small, and then it was worse, I guess, in the September of 2012. So the question is, how much worse do you think 2012 was than 2007? How much less ice was there? You think it was the size of Virginia, or the size of Texas, or the size of Alaska? How many of you say it's Virginia, where I live? A couple of you. Texas. A few of you. State of Alaska. It's Texas. So that's the Arctic ice measurement from September of 2012. So the question then is, okay, let's take this other conversation for a second and look at, there are so many measures, attempted measures of this climate future, and that is, how serious is this climate issue? You've touched on it already, but take that directly on, if you would. How serious, Tom, is it?
Well, of course it's serious. It's a critical issue in how we think about the energy future. And that's where I was going to go before, was to go back to your point.
As you were.
And that is, what Francis says is an exceedingly important point. Once you reach a point with technology change, it appears that there is a solution that trumps everything. It appears that you have a panacea. And in fact, we don't. And especially when times are good, it takes a bit more vision and courage to look around the corners of the future and come up with innovative solutions. See, if you live by this notion of a burning platform, well, any fool will jump off a burning platform. What we've got to do as leaders of the enterprise, however you express it, the environmentalist movement, corporate America, policymakers, politicians, we've all got to have that vision and courage to take accountability for finding solutions even when the wolf may or may not be at the door. Maybe the wolf is at the door. So what are we going to do about that? The fact that we have abundant, cheap natural gas in the United States is a blessing. But we can't let that destroy our initiative. And I think, I talk about this a lot, you can look at it on Google or YouTube or anything else, I think a burning national priority to come up with solutions, not rhetoric, for this nation's energy future. I think it's a big deal.
I think it's a big deal too, and I think the challenge is, how do you do it? So we're in a moment where, in 2009, 2010, there's a big effort to get climate legislation. Everybody, I'm sure, here knows it didn't succeed. Now we are less likely, even less likely, to get a legislative solution. That is, eventually it needs to be on the table, but it's off the table now. So until it can get back on the table, which may be, 2016, 2018 timeframe at the earliest, I think, we need to take action now. And so we have to use the existing authorities that allow us to do that. And part of the president's proposal, which is something that NRDC has been working very hard on, is to use the authorities that exist under the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon, to create a carbon standard on the power sector. Now, in the first administration, the president created fuel efficiency standards for cars. Those have been working on these issues as long as I have. It's taken us more than 3 decades to improve the fuel efficiency of cars. These things take a long time. That was a huge plus as far as reducing a major source of carbon emissions, the automobile sector. And I think this is really the good news is, okay, it happened when the automobile sector was on its knees, and it is completely retooled and created. The automobile companies are rehiring. They have a much wider platform of technology available, from plug-in hybrids to electric. They're examining what new technologies are. So this is creating a huge economic opportunity, as well as addressing a very serious environmental and global problem. And
So
I'll
you're
just
saying
say,
if there are regulations on power plants that may also
I think
stoke
that-
the economy that way?
I believe that will be the case. We need a carbon standard. It's got to be one that's designed flexibly. I'm sure Tom wants to be at the table. The utilities have to be engaged in how that gets created. We have a variety of regions in this country where the energy mix is different in every region. So it has to be designed for the region, and that's why it's not sort of every power plant will get the same measure, but we do need a standard that's created flexibly by the states with all the stakeholders, which means the utilities, which means the consumers, which means the environmentalists, which means the businesses that depend on the energy. But it has to be something that drives our emissions down. We've done it in the transportation sector. We need to do it in the power sector. Power is 40% of our emissions. The utility sector is 40% of our emissions. So it's the largest single thing we can do to drive those emissions down. And Tom has a great story that Southern's emissions have gone way down because of the natural gas opportunity.
Not only that, but other
we need
competing.
to look at other ways to do it too.
One of the things I always cringe just a little.
Only a little?
Yeah, just a little.
Okay. Well,
and we talked about this already.
That means progress.
Yeah, I know it. When we have a conversation about the environment, I don't want to translate it to just carbon or greenhouse gases. There are so many other issues we have to deal with. I personally think water is one of the huge issues of the future. Of course air is, but it's not just carbon in the air. It's mercury and it's ozone and it's particulate matter. Water effluent standards, 316B. There are a host of competing issues that, as leader of the second biggest energy company in America, we have to balance all of that. Of course, greenhouse gases are important, but let's not just get caught up on that, okay? Now, the other thing that I just want to point out, it's not just that gas came into fore. There have been a host of other issues. The recent utility MACT, it's a mercury rule that EPA put out, has caused a tremendous shift in the generating capacity, the ability to generate electrons, not just energy, what you produce, in the nation's energy future. And that will kind of play out through the rest of this decade. The cool thing is, what we've got to do, coming up with solutions, maybe we can invent the future. And one of the things I like to tell people in my industry, certainly in my company, is the idea that if you determine your value by creating a sustainable value proposition for customers, and if that is clean, safe, reliable, affordable, then we better get ahead of the game and perhaps invent the future, or we get overtaken by the future. And so that's where we're, quick plug, we're the only company in our industry, electric utility industry, that still does proprietary research and development. We're the only company in our industry that does at scale carbon capture and storage. We run the nation's carbon capture and storage facility in Alabama. We have a project in Mississippi that is a coal project. It uses lignite, carbon footprint, better than natural gas. What we got to do is use technology and innovation to find solutions to the future to balance that broader objective function.
So this, just quickly, you spoke about it this morning, this carbon capture facility you're talking about. It takes the carbon that instead of going up the smokestack, you actually use it, you liquefy it, and then it actually is an economically useful thing. You can push it down into the ground and get oil out.
Right. It's called enhanced oil recovery.
You are, okay. So then, you're doing all these things already, and as a company, carbon emissions have come down significantly. Then, does that mean that the companies that are ahead, coming back to what the president proposed, if there's enough flexibility in the system, that companies that are innovative can work with that system? I mean, it's a new regulatory regime that the president promises will have flexibility.
Well, sure, we've always got to work with the system. I mean, and here's the other thing, too. You all own stocks, right? Now, I hope that your favorite stock is the Southern Company. But even if it is, I am highly confident that you own a portfolio of stocks. That's the way we ought to think about our energy future. Nuclear is a dominant solution, in my opinion. Natural gas is a dominant solution. Renewables with more innovation that solve some of the limitations, dominant solution. We've got to find a way for the United States still to handle coal. We have the world's largest reserves of coal. 27% of the world's reserves are here. And so solutions like what we're proposing, where it's cleaner than natural gas from a carbon standpoint. And you want to know something else? We're working on the next innovation where it captures all the carbon. That would be pretty cool. And then the last thing that we ought to know as a portfolio is the importance of energy efficiency, or I'm preferring to call that energy productivity these days. The cleanest electron is the one you never consume. So these are all things that we've all got to kind of join arms and get rid of the false choice. It's either the environment or it's production. We got to do both.
So can I just add to that, Scott, because I think that Tom put efficiency last, I'd put efficiency first.
Sure.
Because the thing that's going to make carbon standards affordable is a maximum investment in efficiency, which will basically save money. So efficiency is being used at various rates across the country. For example, in California, they've invested $8 billion in efficiency. They've gotten huge savings as a result. But in the city of New York, where the mayor has a goal to reduce our carbon emissions by 30%, that has to be from the existing building sector. We've barely begun to scratch the surface. Actually, the iconic building, the Empire State Building, has redesigned to be very energy efficient, and will show the way because people are interested in an iconic example for how this can be done by completely re-engineering the building, all new mechanicals in the building, all new windows, et cetera. But because our buildings, which is where does our demand come from? It comes from our buildings. So we have to make our buildings more efficient, and that means retooling the buildings we have. It's very different, for example, if you go to China or India, where they need to have much more efficient buildings, but they're going to be, whereas we have 80% of our buildings by 2030 are built, their buildings of 2030, 80% of them will be brand new. So when you look at the carbon crisis across the world, the solutions are different in different places.
That's right.
And we look at it as a global issue. We're not just looking in the United States, although I think the United States, because we're the largest economy and the second largest emitter, we ought to be leading. We ought to be looking at what the technologies are. We ought to be exporting them. But we can't ignore the other two very large emitters, China the largest, India coming up quickly. And you also have to put it in the context of human needs. When you go to India, 400 million people are without electricity. You can't say you're not going to have electricity. They're using a tiny bit of electricity per capita. We're using a huge amount. So we have to set the example, become a lot more efficient in our systems, and develop the technologies that can be exported. We're looking at, in this carbon standard for the utility sector, we're looking for what can get us to our goals of 2020. But when we go to 2020, 2030, 2030 to 2050, by 2050 we have to an 80% reduction. We're going to have technologies we haven't even dreamed of yet.
Right.
And I think to Tom's point, and I really applaud Southern for this, capturing the carbon from the fossil fuel sector is absolutely bottom line critical, because you can't look at India or China or a lot of other countries that do have coal and assume they're not going to use it. We're lucky in that we have a cleaner source, which is natural gas. We're going to have to capture carbon from that too. But if you're looking at the global picture, we ought to be investing a ton in how to make carbon capture and storage work, because without it, we have an even greater crisis than
But that's
the
still
one I'm imagining.
a significant challenge out there, is it not? To
Huge.
be able to find a way to scale it in a commercial
It's huge.
way in a lot of different places. There are doubters out there, as you know, who think CCS will not. What do you think about the viability, the likelihood, the timeline of that being scaled significantly?
We're doing it now. The project we're building in Mississippi is 582 megawatts. So 1,000 megawatts, what did we say in the
200,000 homes.
200,000 homes.
So it's 100,000
So
homes.
that's scale. And it produces a benefit. It's terrific stuff.
So that's
I mean, can I just ask Tom a question, or only you get to ask
Go.
questions? Okay.
We
so,
should be able to ask each other questions.
All right, so one of my questions is, when the utilities thought there might be a cap and trade system under the Waxman-Markey bill, people were interested in CCS because they thought there's going to be a cap on carbon, we're going to have to figure out what to do with the carbon, invest in CCS. But a lot of that interest just vanished after the bill vanished. So what made you invest in it?
So there's a new book out called Innovative Solutions. It's the history of research and development at Southern Company. It is scintillating reading.
Aren't you giving it to all the people here?
You have the copies somewhere.
Somebody has a copy.
So here's the deal. When we thought about research and development as a cornerstone of our company, so this book was to celebrate the history of it, we're always kind of looking at what are the solutions, what are the problems of the day, and how can we get ahead of these things. Way back when we really started, it was the late 60s, and into the 70s, we were worried about the oil embargo. And so the whole idea then was, what can we do to take coal and turn it into a liquid? Liquefaction is what we called it. That ceased to be as big an issue, and now we said, well, let's gasify it. And let's think about carbon as a great big issue. And how can we now start marrying a process that we developed, proprietary internally, with something that addresses one of the most important issues of the day? We've been able to do this on a number of fronts. When some of the other environmental regulations in the past dealt with NOx and SOx, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, we developed our own scrubber technologies. Here's more trivia you can use at cocktail hour. The world's largest fiberglass vessels were invented by Southern Company, and they're used in our scrubber technology. We've deployed now about at the end of this year anyway, $13 billion of environmental equipment, half of which was proprietary developed by Southern Company R&D. And we do it with partners, like the scrubber was with Chiyoda, a Japanese company. And we've developed it for the benefit of our customers. That is, deployed on time, on budget, and the removal rates are better than anything in the industry. We think that gives us, serving our customers, clean, safe, reliable, affordable energy, a huge advantage. So that's why we continue to invest in it. We think CCS is a super important issue of the day. We don't need a carbon tax. We could get into that, it'd be fun to talk about. What we do, I don't think we need to tax the economy any more than it is. What we do is incorporate a cost of carbon into all of our planning scenarios, $0, $10, $20, $30 by 2015. And we project that with some escalation over time. And that gives us an outcome based on a range of probabilities where we develop dominant solutions for different parts of the portfolio. That's why Southern Company is leading the nation in the renaissance of nuclear. That's why Southern Company has developed a 21st century coal plant. That's why we did 1,200 megawatts of renewables. We run the United States' biggest biomass deal in Texas.
Now, one consultant to the utility industries, he said that all the big utility companies have what you described, this shadow price and carbon in their long-term projections. Is that right? I mean, you spoke about Southern, but is that industry-wide when they plan out?
I couldn't speak for other companies. I don't know.
You don't know?
I'll tell you something else that isn't inhibit.
A lot of them do.
A lot of them do. But here's something
The oil
else that
companies
inhibits
certainly do.
innovation. And a lot of people, why people got out. The deregulation craze that went across America, I don't think served customers' interests. And when you split up the responsibility of make, move, and sell and consume from, so if certain deregulated companies, all they do is make generation. They don't have the value chain accountability finally to customers. It destroys their incentive, in my view. It's the market structure. They're acting completely rationally. But it does not give them the incentive to look across the whole value chain and come up with innovative solutions for the benefit of customers. That's another reason people got out.
Can I just, Scott, address?
Yes, and I'll just get your questions ready. Go ahead.
One thing,
and
so
start opening it up.
one of the reasons that I think it's so imperative that we have a policy that is across the board on climate and carbon standards is that we're experiencing the effects of climate change now. And I mean, everyone in this room, I'm sure, has been some part of the country that's experienced an extreme weather event. I was in New York during Hurricane Sandy. We had a $60 billion authorization by Congress to pay for the costs of Hurricane Sandy. We did an analysis that showed that last year the U.S. spent $111 billion on Sandy, on fires, on drought insurance, on extreme weather events that the country experienced. And these events are getting more frequent, the expense is getting more frequent. So when you look to the future, you have to look at how do we mitigate the worst impacts of climate change? Extreme events are already happening. We are very near the 2% mark. Last week I was in the Arctic. They have a 5% change already. The sea ice, as Scott mentioned, is shrinking. The planetary systems are changing, and we depend on these systems. We depend on air, we depend on water, we depend on soils for food, and this is no joke. This is not something that we can put aside, and I think it's very hard in today's society to look down the road because there's so many immediate challenges. How do we get the economy back on track? How do we fix our education system? How do we address poverty? These are all things that society has to address. It's very difficult, particularly for elected officials who are elected every 4 years, or for members of Congress, to address things that are in the future. But climate change is one of those things. It's really our moral obligation to address it. We have to do it with the tools we have now. They may be imperfect, but they will get us to perhaps the 2020 point where we've begun our reductions. Then we have to have a new set of tools to get us to 2030 and then to 2050. I mean, when you really look at it, we're talking about how do we completely retool the energy sector that we all depend on. And I can just tell you, living in New York, having no power for 5 days in my home or my office, I mean, we all need electricity. And I applaud Tom for providing it to the southern part of the country because we depend on it, we need it. We have to figure out how to supply it in the most efficient and least damaging way. And I think that climate change, the other thing I want to leave you with is not to think of it as an environmental issue, because it's not. It's a societal issue. It's an economic issue. It's a health issue. It's an environmental issue. It crosses the board. And as long as we put it in the environmental space and thinking that somehow the environmental community is going to be able to solve this, we need executives like Tom. We need people in every sector to come together and figure out how we take on this huge challenge and take on the immediacy of it now, even though the consequences are our children's consequences and our grandchildren's consequences. And how we do something that we do poorly, which is act for the future, is the imperative, really, that we're dealing with on this issue.
So just before going to the question, are the two of you actually closer than you think on
No,
this?
because if we actually got into the specifics of the standard, we'd be very far.
Okay.
But we're not going to.
Here's what I hear is, okay.
You don't
Tom
have to
mentioned
suffer through that.
The carbon tax,
Well,
right?
I don't
That's
know that.
not-
You and I never talked about that.
Right.
I can pretty well imagine, but maybe not.
But we've got this technology and innovation and efficiencies coming, and Tom's company is part of that. And then we don't have a carbon tax on the table right now. We have the early stages of proposed regulation where there's flexibility that's been advertised for this. At least you talked about the 2020 near term. If you put those together, are you saying that innovation and flexible regulation can get us there?
We think actually these carbon standards for power plants could get a 26% reduction in the utility sector, which would be a 10% reduction in our overall carbon footprint, which would be the largest single thing to get us on the trajectory of a 17% reduction by 2020, which is what the president pledged to in Copenhagen. So 17% by 2020, I think it's 40% by 2030, and 80% by 2050.
So, but for the
Hang on.
power
It
sector,
begins.
and I would go to
begins.
Tom. You said 26% for the power sector, is
Yeah.
that right?
We've already, Southern Company has already reduced our carbon emissions,
So
I
this
think
will be easy for you.
27%. Listen. I go back to the objective function that I'm accountable for to the families we serve. And let's be very clear about this. 48% make less than $40,000 a year. And it was funny when you said, well, I don't put it last, I put it first. Energy efficiency, look, they're all equal, right? I mean, these things are all important, you know that. Here's an interesting point about energy efficiency. We should use less where we can, but we should use more energy where we should. Returning to those families. They want to live in a better place. They want to eat better. They want to educate their kids better. They want better medical care. When you talked about India and what a tiny sliver of people are served well with energy. In order to raise the human existence, we will consume more energy. Now, we want to be really smart about it and all that. But don't take as an objective function then, use less all the time. Use less where you can, use more where you should.
All right. Got a quick silence. I can ask a question. Go ahead.
Hi, this is for Tom.
Oh, sure. And then I'll go to you after that. Go ahead.
Just for full disclosure, I'm from the private sector, but I'm a trustee of the NRDC.
Perfect.
Yay,
And,
Arjun.
Well
in
done.
the private sector, I'm chairman of the board of a company called Nexent, which is a leader in energy efficiency. So we do about 160 million a year, hopefully do over 200 million this year, and we watched efficiency grow.
Right.
I have two questions for you. One is apparently, and I'd love to learn more about it offline, you've made some huge breakthroughs in R&D and actually implemented them in your plants.
Right.
Have you patented that, or have you put it in the open domain so everyone who cannot afford that R&D can use it? That's the first. The second is, assuming everything you say is true, that you're a model utility, you've done everything right. How do you plan that as a nation and a planet, that we actually force the people who don't comply without a tax?
Oh,
I
listen.
I hope you got my question, right?
Yeah. So a lot of layers in that. It's kind of interesting. What do you mean if it was true what I said? Just kidding. So let's think about
So
that.
the first is your innovation in the open domain, so everyone can use it and take advantage of it for the planet?
So
Second is-
okay, so the first question. It depends on what we've done. For example, in scrubbers, what we did, we cut a deal with our partner, Chiyoda, so that the benefit, we got reduced capital costs, so the price of installing the scrubbers that we designed, we got a big discount relative to the market, and we gave all of that benefit to the customers of the Southern Company, Alabama Power, Georgia Power, Mississippi Power, Gulf Power, Panhandle, Florida. So that is one of the explanations why it's so cheap. And then we let Chiyoda deploy it across the United States. So that's one way. With respect to the technology that we have that's called TRIG, T-R-I-G, this is the one that removes 65 to 70% of CO2, we have a worldwide licensing agreement with KBR. It's not an open architecture. I used to be CIO one time in my career. Of course, I thought that meant career is over. But it's not an open architecture. I don't think that our customers who put up the money, our shareholders, would just want to give away the benefit. So we want to capture the benefit. But we're certainly making it available for anybody that wants to use it worldwide. And the TRIG technology is being developed also in China, in Dongguan province. So we do that. What was your next one?
The second one is, let's say all these standards are put in place.
Yep.
Let's say you guys are complying.
Sure.
Without a tax, how do you make sure that you keep everyone honest, not just
Oh, sure.
the
Got it.
front runners that want to comply?
Got it. Look, I think there's lots of different ways to skin that cat without putting a burdensome tax on the economy. And let me refer back to the families that I'm so concerned about. Their demand for energy.
You're complying, so you don't.
those
families are covered.
Well, hang on. I find it important to talk about my kind of North Star all the time, and that's customers. Those families have a relatively inflexible appetite for energy. They want to be warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and they want lights, all right? So when you put a carbon tax, it tends to be really regressive. Well, I know the rejoinder is, oh, well, we'll redistribute it somehow. The government doesn't have a great track record of that. So we got to do something that treats people fairly. I'm very concerned about that. In terms of, so what is the right mechanism to incent somebody to abide by a cleaner carbon future? Okay? There's lots of different ways to cut it. One of the ways that I've talked about is a form of a clean energy standard. Now, remember I said Southern is the only company that does proprietary research and development. The broad research and development arm in our industry is called EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute. It's essentially a research co-op, okay? I used to be vice chair of that. A Southern Company person is chairwoman of that now. I think we're the biggest funder of EPRI, so I love EPRI. But the problem with kind of co-ops is that the approaches to innovation tend to be a little vanilla. They tend to abide by a broad base. And I think really edgy, punchy innovation is developed in a proprietary sense, okay? One of the things that EPRI has done exceedingly well in response to kind of the Waxman-Markey days, was come up with a concept of, they called PRISM, P-R-I-S-M. And then they came up with PRISM 2.0. Some marketing guy got paid $100,000 for that. And here's what PRISM 2.0 tells you. That with respect of achieving 80% reductions by 2050, the Waxman-Markey objective, the different regions of the country will have very different approaches, very different objective functions, if you will. And that's why a national RPS doesn't make any sense at all in my view. But from a regional standpoint, and I like to do that at the lowest possible level, that I think we can make great strides here. For example, in the Southeast, what you tend to get as a dominant solution is nuclear, is coal and gas with CCS, is imported wind with some sort of storage technology. And let me just turn you on your head a little bit. One of the problems in the electric utility industry is you can't store electricity. Or you can't do it very efficiently anyway.
That's a technology challenge.
So one of our research efforts, and we got into this in the morning, is to try and figure out a way to store energy at scale. Instead of a battery, let's think about the Earth as a battery. And let's take sometimes negatively priced wind out of Texas. Let's inject it underground in this beautiful geology we have in kind of the southwest portion of our region. So we have air under pressure. It's called CAES, compressed air energy storage. And then we'll take it out during peak parts of the day so that that now has real capacity value.
So that's banking the wind energy for when you want it?
Yeah.
All right.
And you can do pump storage, hydro, and a variety of other things. There's water applications to this too. You know, I'm very dicey about using water for stuff. So what you can do is have overlays in regions of kind of a regional portfolio objective. And then let every state be accountable for, over time, meeting that portfolio.
But Tom, that's what the carbon standard under the Clean Air Act would envision, that basically you have state flexibility around what the state mix is, and that the utilities in the states, they figure out what's the mix for them, and then they do a state implementation plan. So it's not, because the country is really different. You know, some parts have totally different energy mixes, and you have to design for that, absolutely.
I think, Tom, you answered, having flexible mixes, and I agree, the product mix should be changed or allowed to be changed. My real issue is still the same, which is how do you incent or tax the non-compliers to comply?
Well, you don't tax them. You make it you will abide by law and regulation. Otherwise, you go to jail.
Utilities don't go to jail.
You don't do it
They
with
do whatever they
taxes.
want.
Don't do it with taxes. I think
But you're saying that there would be some kind of a
forcing
for each state
mechanism.
or for each region.
Just
they
as
have
there
to
is
say,
regulatory.
we have to accommodate by
Under
the Clean Air
Yeah,
Act.
this would be under the Clean Air Act.
There's not a
Do the
tax
same
in the
kind of
Clean Air
fines.
Act, for heaven's sakes.
Okay, let's go on to this gentleman's question right here.
Thanks. I'll make a quick comment and then a question. But my comment is this, is that I'm Australian. We instigated a carbon tax. It was very well thought out. We kind of structured it all right. It didn't work, right? We didn't raise the money we thought we'd raise. The amount of money that was there for redistribution and compensation was nowhere near what we needed, and it was handled really badly. So, it didn't get to where it was supposed to go. So, in practice, it probably sounds great. But the reality of a practice in a developed country that's got a very sophisticated market, it didn't work. And cap and trade in Europe essentially didn't work. So I'm not sure that's the answer. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure that's not it. That's my comment. Here's my question. This one's pretty simple. I don't know if the answer's simple. I've got a friend of mine who comes from a very wealthy family. He's got a lot of spare time, and he's passionate about this topic of energy and climate change. He's done a lot of research. He spends a lot of time going to conferences. He's convinced, to your 2% comment, Scott, you touched on it. 2 degrees, sorry. He's convinced we're screwed.
That we're screwed.
That we're screwed. We're going to go over that 2 degrees by a mile, and it's done. I'm interested in your 2 views on that.
Spend the day with Al Gore, same. But I don't think you can stop there. I mean, the fact is, the climate's warming, it's changing. We have to do what we can do. It is changing. And I mean, all of the marks that the scientists developed, we're passing. But we still have to get on with it. Right. We can't ignore it. And I think all I'm saying about that is that drives the urgency for action even more. So I agree that we're heading down that road very, very seriously, and we got to get going. That's why, the president finally getting out there this week with a plan that we can get behind and get moving on, and not waiting for some eventuality with Congress is so critical.
Do you think he's right, though? Are we going to blow through that 2 degrees?
I think we are blowing through the 2 degrees. I mean, it'll be very hard to stop that. Even with the things that we know we have to do, it takes time to do them, and there's a lot already in the system. But we have to mitigate as much as we can and prepare for what the consequences are going to be. I mean, unfortunately, that's true. We started this 20 years ago, and there was so much debate. Is it a problem? Is it a problem? Is it a problem? Now we're at a point where, guess what? It's a problem. We got to deal with it.
Well, for a while, there was a lot of study on what 2 degrees might mean. The World Bank is looking into now what 4 degrees might mean.
Right.
So whatever that may be or may not be, the questions are changing.
The point here that I think, whether you believe that's true or not, one of the sayings at Southern Company is that we're all about solutions, not rhetoric. We've got to get about it. We've got to continue to invest and promote. If you look at any of my stuff, I just gave a big speech on Energy Information Administration. I talk about the need for a national imperative for energy innovation, just as a moonshot, just as we've done in IT and everything else. We got to get about it. Thanks, Mom.
Another question, please. Question over here, please.
Hi, I'm just curious to know why we haven't talked about solar today.
Solar?
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of solar.
Yeah, how much solar is in your
So
portfolio?
let me just kind of talk
What's
about
in your portfolio? Let's
let's just talk about it. Southern did 1,200 megawatts of renewables last year. We have the largest voluntary solar program in the United States in Georgia. We have invested with Ted Turner in solar projects in New Mexico, Nevada, California, and we're looking at more to do. And, if you looked at my stuff too, there are some limitations on central station renewables. But where I think there may be something that really could be potentially a game changer is in distributed generation. And I'm a big fan of thin film photovoltaic solar, not thermal solar, which uses water, as a potential resource for the future. Here's the problem. If you have distributed generation, so if you're going to put a solar cell on your rooftop, right? The early adopters of that are likely to be affluent people that have a decision criteria that may not sit solely on economics. Because right now, it is not economic, at least where we live. Our power is about 10% below the national average. And so you just can't make it
It's
make
hard
sense.
for solar to compete with
Where it's
in
cheap.
your area. Okay.
But in the Northeast, California, maybe it does. But here's what I believe about solar. The production cost curves continue to come down. The translation efficiency of sunlight into electricity continues to improve. And my own instinct, not fact, is that by 2018, 2020, somewhere in there, it's going to be a big deal. Now, the challenge is, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine? Here's what I believe we should do. We've got to create right pricing mechanisms so that we adequately price the fixed charge of connecting to the electric network so that when the sun doesn't shine for whatever reason, power gets delivered to the residents or the commercial operation or the industrial factory. Further, when the sun doesn't shine, you've got to have a backup power source. So it's not just the wires, it's the backup generation. Because if early adopters are likely to be affluent people, which they are, most likely, if you don't price it right, you get the less affluent subsidizing the affluent. My view is we continue to work on technology innovation to provide either a battery resource or an alternative generation resource that can be micro in the home that could obviate the problem I'm talking about. But in the absence of technology innovation, we got to price it right. And if we do those things, my sense is by 2020, distributed generation could be a big deal.
So just to add to that briefly, first of all, renewables are a hugely important part of the future. They're growing very rapidly, both wind and solar. The price of solar is going down, but the price of natural gas is very low. So one of the things, the reason that public policies are so important, we do need these renewable portfolio standards. I think more than 30 states have them. if we could get one at the national level so that we're driving that technology, we're driving the price down so that it is available. I mean, Tom identified some of the issues with it, but it's still in the single digits of the amount of power being delivered in the US. We can easily get into the double digits. Some states like Iowa, 20% of their power is now coming from wind. 8% is coming from Texas, huge state. But there's just a lot more opportunity there. You need to put the policies in place that allow that to happen and compete in a market where natural gas is undercutting all of these other innovative technologies. And that's, 5 years ago we weren't there. The prices of the renewables weren't that low, but natural gas wasn't so low either. And now, we have to, because we can't, the market has a role to play, but policy has an equal role to play if you're trying to design a future that's low carbon.
Your backup generation resource right now for renewables, most any renewable, is going to be natural gas right now. So to the extent the United States has already made a big bet on natural gas, we've already made the big bet. We've moved from 70% coal to 35 coal, from energy production, 16 natural gas now to 45, 47. We could take it as high as 55 if the economics dictated it.
So you're
My
saying
worry, hang on, my worry is that we're going to put too many eggs in that basket. And so we've got to find a way to solve 5 problems. Quickly, we got to
Which
resolve...
basket, the natural gas basket?
Yes,
Okay.
natural gas
I'm
basket.
with that.
We've got to resolve environmental issues around fracking.
Yes.
Number 2, we've got to build out the infrastructure. Think about all the arguments we just had on this pipeline. Well, now we've got to build out
Still
new
having
pipelines.
them.
Okay, new pipelines for natural gas. Number 3, we're about to make some huge national bets on exporting this resource. I'm in favor of that, by the way. Number 4, we're having a huge demand curve transfer shift in the United States. Manufacturing, perhaps transportation, CNG vehicles, my own industry. 2011, the United States consumed 67 BCF, billions of cubic feet per day of natural gas. A lot of estimates say that by 2020, you could be over 100 BCF per day. What happens to price and volatility? And is that good for America? Gives me to 5. We've got to be able to hedge that rationally long term. Right now, we can't do that very well in that industry for some arcane reasons. I'd be glad to talk about later.
Later.
Right. All right, we have a few minutes left. Did that answer your solar question? Okay. Please.
I just wanted to ask a
Go
question.
ahead. Yes, and then we'll go to you
sorry.
afterward.
The energy
No, go ahead.
expert.
Oh, yeah, my partner.
I did hear something about, not wanting hydro, but we'll take that offline. So my question is, what do you think about source response? We've heard a lot about demand response, but source response, where actually there have been some experiments that have been done that when you have, say, on the order of 10,000 thermostats, that you can actually follow the wind as the source, so you're actually responding to the source and not to the demand. So is that something, I guess the question to Tom is that something that you have a plan or a strategy to integrate it into Southern?
Every bit of that makes sense. Look, if it makes sense at the end of the day to optimize the portfolio, you're talking about one of the limitations, if you will, the intermittency of renewables. If you can design a system from a demand standpoint that helps follow the intermittency, that's wonderful. One other point that you were getting to, you may have been getting to, but I'm gonna co-op.
He's going to get to it.
And that is energy efficiency. Let's expand the notion from just beyond the meter, okay, thermostats and refrigerators and HVAC systems, to all the way to converting a fuel stock into an electron. Let's do that as efficiently as we can. Let's improve heat rates.
No, that's right.
That's good for the environment, good for the bottom line. That's make. Move. Let's improve transmission systems. And let's have less electron losses as we think about those. And then finally, consume and sell.
Okay, and this will be our last one here. Thanks.
I'm not in the industry. I've been coming to this conference for 3 years now, and I hear a lot of stuff. I'm more on the NRDC side of things than the industry side.
Closer, please.
But I come to this conference and I hear lots and lots that sounds really positive and really hopeful. All the technology's there, all the answers are there. We just haven't gotten off the dime and done it. It's wonderful to hear that you have, and a few years ago I think we heard that DuPont Energy was way ahead in the game also. But we're still seeing these CO2 numbers rise. We went over 400. It's like we're not getting there. We're not seeing the legislation. We're not seeing the enforcement. We're seeing, even when the country agrees 90% on some issue, we can't get it passed through Congress. It's like we're not getting there. How do we get over this cliff into action?
Well, what I would say is we have to use the tools that are there. So the tool we have now that allows us to get going is the Clean Air Act. We have to use it. As Tom said, we've used it for sulfur, we've used it for nitrogen, we've used it now for mercury and air toxics. We can use it for carbon. We have to do that because you can't go to Congress and you can't do it on a voluntary basis. This is too important for the future of society. We have to get it done. And so, we're looking at what are the practical things we can do. We can put a carbon standard on that is going to drive carbon emissions down, and we can provide those incentives to unleash clean energy and efficiency, and we've got to do both. I think when we were looking at the Waxman-Markey bill, we thought, here's a big answer to the question. There's no big package that we're going to be able to tie up in a ribbon. There are going to be a lot of very specific policies. It takes a lot of very hard work, one at a time. But one thing that we really do need is we need leaders in society to get behind it. As I said, this isn't something for the environmental community to do alone. To have people like Tom in his position, when we were doing Waxman-Markey, we had the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, which was 30 CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies. We need that voice because everyone who's involved needs to figure out how to make it work for them, but they have to have a common commitment to drive down the emissions. And, I actually think, when you talk to people one-on-one, we're there. How you shape it, and it'll be very interesting going forward now with the Clean Air Act, to work together and to figure out what that structure is that's going to work and not spend a lot of time arguing about it, but get going. So I share your frustration. I mean, listen, I've been working on this for almost 2 decades, and I'm still at it. But, I'm confident that we have the tools that can get us there. And I do think that there's a much greater appreciation, which is unfortunate because people are experiencing a lot of the changes. So whereas 10 years ago, people were like, I don't know if it's real. People are going, oh my gosh, look what's happening in my community. And it's become very personal, not only from a climate change standpoint, but also from an energy development standpoint. I mean, with the energy independence that we are now experiencing, energy has become a very personal issue to people all across the country because there's fracking in their community, there are pipelines in their state, there are oil spills on their beaches, and this is all our homegrown energy. So I think there's a much greater awareness of the consequences of what our energy needs are, and more awareness that, we got to deal with these things. It's not so abstract. We used to be worried about the security problem of importing everything, but we never saw actually much about what the impacts of the development is. Now there are people across the country who are alarmed about the consequences. So it's from the very large scale of what's the impact of climate change on the planet to a community in Pennsylvania which is overrun by the natural gas industry and has sort of lost their community in the process.
Let me give you the last word quickly just on this planetary.
But I got a 30-minute answer here. No, I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. It's Southern, in fact, you want to look up more detail here. I wrote a little book, a little tiny little book called Leadership Perspectives, and it gets into 2 very important concepts. When companies think about what they do, we call those the whats. For us, it's make, move, and sell electricity. But one of the things that Southern espouses as part of our corporate ethos is that the hows, our behaviors towards society, each other, customers, external publics, is as important and arguably way more powerful. When you talk about real sustainability in a corporate sense, I think it is your hows that propel companies forward for decades to come. And I think that, frankly, is how my company has been and continues to be built. One of the concepts we have is be a citizen wherever we serve, to make sure that the communities are better off because we're there. And so, certainly since I've taken this job, and you can look at it, we take responsibility as one of the leaders of an enterprise that I said could be the environmental movement, it could be corporations, it could be politics or policy, to get out there and try and drive action. And so I'm active in my own industry, I'm active at the Business Roundtable. Here's another thing. Companies always in matters of strategy have elements of offense and defense. And I would argue that a lot of companies have played defense for so long on these kinds of issues. And what we've got to do, and I think Americans are thirsting for, a way to play offense in a challenged environment.
Absolutely.
Whether it's the economy, whether it's the environment, whether it's anything. Let's find a way together to play offense.
Thank you.
On those
Tom
carbon
Finney,
standards.
that's Francis Beinecke. Thanks to you all.